Okay, the one thing that China is not open about, when you're suggesting that India's economy should be open and to be protectionist is actually protecting vested interests. What about democracy? What about political and civil liberties? And I ask this because there's a huge question around, for example, China's treatment of its Muslim population, and this is a story that never even gets addressed, never even gets spoken about.
大家好，今天要分享的是新加坡资深外交官学者马凯硕接受印度媒体 Mojo Story 专访的一段精彩节选。马凯硕曾任新加坡常驻联合国代表，联合国安理会轮值主席，现为新加坡国立大学亚洲研究所杰出研究员。他著有《中国赢了吗？亚洲的21世纪》等多部关于中国和亚洲地缘政治的著作，观点犀利，直言不讳。在这场对话中，面对印度主持人带有明显偏见和情绪化倾向的连番追问，从所谓新疆问题到中印边境冲突，从 RCEP 到贸易逆差，马凯硕始终保持着资深外交家的冷静与克制，没有陷入无谓的争论，而是用事实和逻辑层层拆解，不动声色地给对手上了一堂地缘政治课。他直言西方在人权问题上双重标准，提醒印度不要感情用事，要学会狡猾地在大国博弈中找准自己的位置。他还以越南为例，说明一个曾经与中国兵戎相见的国家如何通过开放经济和务实合作实现自身快速发展。这场对话信息密度极大，马凯硕的许多观点值得反复品味。下面我们就来看看马凯硕在这场访谈中是怎么说的。
Okay, the one thing that China is not open about, when you're suggesting that India's economy should be open and to be protectionist is actually protecting vested interests. What about democracy? What about political and civil liberties? And I ask this because there's a huge question around, for example, China's treatment of its Muslim population, and this is a story that never even gets addressed, never even gets spoken about. We saw a shocking story on Al Jazeera this week, which spoke about Muslims in internment camps being forced to eat pork every Friday as part of what's called re-education. Do civil liberties not matter at all? When it comes to India, the whole world comments. When it comes to China, everybody's quiet.
Well, I think, as you know, India was very upset when Prime Minister Trudeau yesterday made some comments
about the farmer protest. Yes.
Yeah, and I think we in Asia are wiser than the West is. And just to put in a big historical context, I've been a student of the West for a long time. The West has lost its political domination. It has lost its economic domination. It only now has intellectual domination. And it preserves its intellectual domination by lecturing the whole world on human rights issues, when the West, as you know, is completely hypocritical on human rights issues. I'll give you a simple example. The European countries will condemn any country that carries out torture, right? If India carries out waterboarding, the European countries will be the first to insist that India stops waterboarding. But when the United States was the first major developed country to reintroduce torture, the European countries kept absolutely quiet. But whenever any government tries to criticize any country on human rights, I say they've got double standards, because they will only criticize their adversaries and not their friends. And just, since you mentioned how bad the human rights situation is in China, in the 1971, when United States was fighting the evil Soviet Empire, it had a choice. It could either join the world's largest democracy in India to fight the Soviet Union, or it could fight the largest communist government in the world, which, by the way, under Mao, saw far greater human rights abuses than anything you have in China today, right? Far greater. And you know what? The great democracy, United States, chose China over India. And I think many Indians, if you don't mind me saying this, can be very naive about geopolitics. Geopolitics is not about friendship. Geopolitics is not about whether they like you or love you. Geopolitics is all about what's in my interest. And that's what they will do. And so I think it's important to, the European Union also wanted to impose human rights standards on India also. So that's what they've been doing all the time. So it's important in geopolitics, as I said, calculate what is in your interest and do what's in your interest.
But what happens then to civil liberties? I actually agree with you. I agree with you on the one point that you make, that a lot of commentary by the Western world is full of humbug and full of hypocrisy. I mean, I remember this time, for example, when Obama was on a presidential visit to India, and before going, he made a lot of comments about the constitutional sort of need to preserve pluralism in India, which of course is all true. But then he took the flight from here to Saudi Arabia, where he didn't say anything of the kind. So one does see all of these gaping double standards. But when you think of, and I agree with you on that, but when you think of these Muslims in internment camps in China, and you hear the horror stories that come out, should the world look the other way? And there are things, for example, when you look back at, let's say, apartheid and Africa, there has been moments in history when global pressure has pushed change. So, is your binary really sort of always applicable?
No. By the way, I want to emphasize that we should advance human rights.
Yeah.
Because, I don't want to live in a country where my nails are being pulled out, I don't like that.
Yeah.
But just since you mentioned apartheid, I mean, you must surely know the reason why the apartheid regime was so resilient and could survive so many years is because United States and United Kingdom supported South Africa. I mean, I hope you know that.
Of course. Margaret Thatcher, and Thatcher's the enormous pressure on Thatcher from the Commonwealth to actually impose those sanctions. But
and you know that the United States Congress declared Nelson Mandela a terrorist. And do you know that they only removed the terrorist title 6 years after apartheid ended? I mean, look at that. So you tell me that the United States is a defender of human. United States.
I don't care about the United States. I'm just asking how the world should react. The world is not the United States.
True. But at the same time, I completely agree with you. But as you know, if someone came to India and lectured India publicly and say, why did you tear down the mosque? Why do you do all that? You know everyone's going to react very badly. In Chinese behavior on Xinjiang, and I would say, frankly, if it's about Muslims, don't you think the Muslim countries should take the lead? How is it that when the Western countries wrote a letter criticizing China, not one Muslim country supported that letter, not one.
The silence of the Muslim countries, one of the countries of the world that has remained silent is Pakistan. Right.
Yes.
And from an Indian perspective, Pakistan now is seen almost as a kind of vassal state of China. And so when these border tensions, in fact, erupted, one of the things that the Indian military had to war game was for a possible two-front conflict, and it's always war gamed for that. But there's a kind of, Pakistan is sort of being seen as a continuum of China. How do you see that relationship? Obviously, for China, it's all about self-interest. For any nation, its choices are about self-interest. There, I agree with you. But from an Indian perspective, we're looking at this. We're looking at Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. We're looking at the sort of, one border, one road project, and we're going. Pakistan is just like now an addendum, almost an addendum to China.
Well, in international affairs. I always believe that the biggest problem is when you get emotional, right? Mm-hmm. And if Pakistan was a complete vassal state of China, why does it go to the IMF when it needs assistance, right? Mm-hmm. It's a vassal state of China. It should say, to hell with the IMF, to hell with all that. I mean, that doesn't make sense. And so I would say that, it's a big mistake to use labels, okay? Yeah. And it's also important to ask yourself, again, if you don't mind me being very frank, why does India always focus on problems of the past, on differences, and not focus on what can be done to learn lessons from others and learn to find a better way? There are better
So
ways.
how do you see, for example, the Pakistan-China equation?
Well, I think, geopolitics, as I told you earlier,
Yeah.
where just as the United States chose the world's largest communist country under Mao Zedong as a partner, countries don't care what your internal system is about. If it suits their geopolitical interests, they will work with the country. And right now, there's a convergence of geopolitical interests within Pakistan and China. So that's what happens. So, and just as there is, by the way, a convergence of geopolitical interests within India and United States today. That's what's happening also. And that is not driven by the fact that they like each other or believe in each other. It's about geopolitical interests. China and Vietnam are far greater adversaries. And look at the trade between Vietnam and China today. It's amazing. So, and at the end of the day, why is Vietnam doing this? Let me tell you what Vietnam is doing this. Vietnam is trading heavily with China, not because the Vietnamese love China. They are using China to make themselves strong in the same way that China used the United States to make itself strong. So you use your adversary to make yourself stronger. Now that's the best game of geopolitics you can play.
Okay, I have some questions for you on our live stream that I want to actually just pick up one by one. First is that Abhishek Singh says the onus of resolving the differences between India and China at the moment should be on China. Why blame India?
I'm sorry. I can only help you by being very frank. I've studied geopolitics for 50 years. I don't know of any geopolitical dispute where one side is 100% right and the other side is 100% wrong. In the case of China and India, the border dispute, you also know that 3 times the Chinese leaders, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, proposed to India, we will never be able to figure this all out, this border dispute. Why not just accept the line as it is and settle as it is? And as you know, 3 times India turned China down. That's also a fact. And frankly, I think it was unwise to turn down that offer. It was very unwise because that would have settled the matter. And as you know, China has settled its border disputes with Russia, with Vietnam, with Mongolia, with everybody else. It's settled. So it is possible to do a deal. And I think it's important, therefore, to figure out at the end of the day, if you want to succeed, you got to figure out what are my bigger, more fundamental interests. And this is a marathon race between China and India. It's a marathon race. We will know the winner 100 years from now. And the marathon race will be determined by who has the stronger economic legs.
We have a question on our live stream from Sanjay who says, no, I don't agree. The free trade agreement between any country and China can only benefit China because trade with China is a one-way street.
Okay. By the way, trade can never be one way.
I think the point is that it's not a level.
Excuse me. You know something? Yeah. If it is all one way, you know what's going to happen? Nobody, if others don't benefit from trading with China, then they won't have money to buy goods from China. To buy goods from China. And by the way, if you look at Southeast Asia again, it's amazing that the Southeast Asian economies, which were behind China in so many ways, many of them have surplus with China. And by the way, it is possible to negotiate a free trade deal with China where China will give you unilateral concessions temporarily to enable you to catch up in the competition. And China was very generous to Southeast Asia in giving what they call an early harvest in that.
So I want to give you a sense of how a lot of Indians feel, and that's why I'm picking up an emotional question, even though you spend a lot of time of the conversation saying the one thing you should never be in geopolitics is emotional. But this reflects how many Indians are thinking and feeling today. Nandita Ghosh on our stream says China wants to push India into a war and then it will crush India. There is a sense, what you call the marathon competition on between India and China. There is a sense that there's room for only one winner here. Right. And that is why the kind of sort of coexistence that you're speaking about, even though there are not the kind of historical conflicts that India has with Pakistan, with China. And, I remember Modi used to say before this border conflict that not one shot has been fired at these borders for decades. That unfortunately now doesn't apply. We're actually seeing a kind of, we've seen a military conflict. But how do you address this Indian apprehension, which is very real, which is very widespread, that now the narrative is it's not Pakistan, it's China that's the real adversary. It's China that has blocked, for example, UN sanctions against terror groups like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jamaat-e-Dawa. You've served as the president of the UN Security Council. You know what these concerns are about. So just address that concern that China does not even stand with India on the issue of terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the question from Nandita Ghosh that China wants to push India into a war and then it can try to crush India.
Yes.
Sometimes some truths are very painful. The Chinese are very, very concerned about a war. But they're very concerned about a war with the United States. Very concerned. Right. Because the United States is clearly trying to push China down. I mean, that's obvious, for obvious reasons. And if you go to Beijing, and of course, I've been there a few times, and you mention India, they look very puzzled. Oh, really? They're concerned about us? Why? China, I was amazed at the indifference of the Chinese to India. Because for them, their number one threat, and by the way, there'll be a monumental struggle between US and China in the next 20 years. The Chinese have only one obsession. They got to survive this US onslaught against China, which is coming, which is, as I say, I've documented in my book, Has China Won? And they are focused on that. And so as a result of that, that creates opportunities for others. So it creates opportunities for Southeast Asia. Because in Southeast Asia, because China doesn't want Southeast Asia to become an anti-Chinese lake, the Chinese are doing their best to build win-win economic partnership with Southeast Asia. And I can guarantee you this, that if you can sit down and have a rational dialogue, where you've got to push aside your emotions for a while, you'll find that China will be very happy to work out a win-win arrangement with India too, for the same reason that they want to focus on the United States. And you're right to point out the major trade deficit between US and within China and India. You're absolutely right. But there are ways and means of dealing with trade deficits. And, for example, when the United States was very worried about the major trade deficit with the Japanese, as you know, the United States and Japan had negotiations, and the Japanese agreed to what is called VERs, voluntary export restraints. So, that what I'm saying to you is there's no problem in the world is new. Every problem has got a precedent. And so you can find ways and means of dealing with it, and then take advantage of the larger market.
And there are questions on that, and I'll come to that. But if the Chinese are indeed indifferent to India, how do you explain this mass military buildup at the border with India? Well, why block sanctions against terror groups like the JUD and the Jaish-e-Mohammed?
One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Exhibit A, Mandela. Mandela was called a terrorist by United States, as you know. But on the cases you mentioned, yes, it's unwise of China to block the designation of terrorist groups. I agree with you there.
Okay, talking about technology, how do you see the Indian move to block a whole host of Chinese apps?
Oh, I would say that's peanuts. Peanuts.
Why?
You know, life is much bigger than this TikTok, PUBG. And this is an example of being petty. It's peanuts.
Okay.
The Chinese don't care. The Chinese, remember, from the Chinese point of view, there is a much bigger game. And you can ban TikTok, you can do all that. It doesn't hurt China at all. No, zero hurt at all. But the important thing to ask, what if I was an Indian?
Yeah.
I would ask a very simple question. My number one competitor today is China.
Yeah.
What is China doing right? What is China doing wrong? What is India doing right? What is India doing wrong? And then calculate. And then I can tell you, let me come onto your program 10 years from now.
10 years. Okay.
10 years from now.
Long.
And I'll tell you the world,
game.
and I'll tell you what the world will be. 10 years from now, United States will be number 2. China will be number 1. And you know what? China and the United States will come to some accommodation. 10 years from now.
What will happen to China?
The United States,
and China and India? Where will China and India be 10 years from now in this equation, in your opinion?
It all depends on how cunning India is. It all depends on how you play the game.
Right.
You see, right now, you have a window of opportunity because China is still number 2. It's much easier to negotiate with the number 2, not with the number 1. But you want to wait 10 years? Then when you negotiate with the number 1, it's much harder. So you got to be very brutal about these things, and stop being so emotional. I mean that's a fundamental problem with the way Indians look at the world. By the way, I'm not every other country looking at this whole thing is sort of wondering why are the Indians so can't set aside one thing and say, okay, let's focus on the big picture. The big picture is the economic game.
Right.
And are you winning the economic game, or are you losing the economic game? It's very simple.
看完这段对话，说实话，最让我感慨的不是马凯硕那些犀利的观点本身，而是印度主持人那种典型的西方中心主义思维和赤裸裸的双重标准。他一边对中国新疆问题义愤填膺，引用半岛电视台的报道大做文章，一边对印度国内愈演愈烈的宗教冲突，对穆斯林的系统性歧视绝口不提。他质问中国没有民主、没有人权、没有公民自由，却对自己国家那些被国际人权组织反复警告的问题选择性失明。这就是典型的我可以你不行的双标逻辑。更值得我们思考的是马凯硕如何应对这种充满敌意的提问。他没有被对方的情绪带着走，没有去争论那些已经被证实的假新闻，而是直接跳出了对方设定的框架，反手揭露了西方世界在人权问题上的虚伪。他举了一个非常有力的例子，欧洲国家会谴责任何实施酷刑的国家，但当美国重新引入酷刑时，欧洲国家却集体沉默了。他还提醒主持人，1971年美国在对抗苏联时选择的是中国而不是印度，尽管当时的中国在所谓人权问题上更糟糕。这说明什么？说明地缘政治从来不讲道义，不讲感情，讲的是利益，是算计，是大国博弈中的生存智慧。马凯硕反复提醒印度不要被情绪绑架，不要陷入我永远无法利用我的对手这种思维，要学会狡猾，要学会利用中美之间的矛盾为自己争取最大利益。他甚至提出了一个大胆的设想，中国、印度、巴基斯坦3方自由贸易协定，把主持人当场镇住了。当然，他也坦诚地说，这在当下不现实，但东亚已经做到了。马凯硕还给印度开出了一个非常直白的药方：开放经济，参与竞争，不要用保护主义保护少数既得利益者。他以越南和印尼为例，说明越开放，越融入全球体系，减贫效果就越显著，经济增长就越快。他甚至把矛头指向了印度的封闭政策。 为什么印度人在全世界都做得很好，唯独在印度不行？因为印度经济是封闭的。他说，真正该对印度开放感到恐惧的是世界其他国家，因为印度人天生好胜，一旦开放将遥遥领先。这段话既是忠告，也是讽刺。印度害怕的恰恰是自己的潜力。在整个对话中，马凯硕展现了一个资深外交官应有的格局和智慧。面对情绪化的指控，他不卑不亢，不回避，不迎合，而是用事实、逻辑和历史经验把问题讲透讲清。他对印度主持人的那番话，其实对很多国家都适用。在地缘政治中，最忌讳的就是感情用事，要学会着眼大局，要懂得取舍。他建议印度不要在中美之间选边站，而是坐稳跷跷板的中间位置，让两边都来争取你，这样你的筹码才是最大的。他还提出了一个技术性的解决方案，在边境全线安装传感器，用科技手段避免士兵因帐篷在不在这种小事发生肢体冲突。这种务实、理性、可操作的建议才是真正解决问题的思路。反观那位印度主持人，全程被情绪和偏见主导，问题一个比一个尖锐，却始终拿不出任何建设性的方案，最后只能以感谢参与草草收场。这让我想起马凯硕在书中反复强调的一个观点：21世纪是亚洲的世纪，但亚洲要真正崛起，必须处理好两个核心关系，一是中美关系，二是中印关系。中美关系已经进入结构性对抗阶段，短期内难以缓和，而中印关系恰恰是亚洲最有可能改善，也最需要改善的双边关系。他坦诚地说，如果中印针锋相对，亚洲世纪就彻底没戏了。这不仅是他的判断，也是整个亚洲的共识。但问题是，印度能不能跳出那个1962年情节，能不能不再把中国视为头号威胁，而是看作一个可以利用的对手？如果能，那印度还有机会成为亚洲世纪的重要一极；如果不能，那印度很可能被边缘化，在中美之间两头不讨好。马凯硕在对话末尾提出了一个10年预测，10年后美国将退居第2，中国将成为第1，中美之间会达成某种妥协，而印度届时处于什么位置，完全取决于印度有多狡猾。这句话既是忠告，也是警钟，留给印度的时间窗口正在收窄。如果你现在不跟老二谈好条件，等他成了老大，你再想谈，难度就大得多了。这个逻辑简单直接，但很多印度人就是听不进去，因为他们太情绪化了，太纠结于那几平方英里的争议领土，而忽略了更大的棋盘，更根本的国家利益。马凯硕的这番话不仅是在对印度说，也是在提醒所有国家，21世纪的大国博弈，拼的是经济规模，是发展速度，而不是航空母舰的数量，不是战斗机有多少架。你经济强了，话语权自然就来了；你经济弱了，说什么都没用。这是一个残酷但真实的现实。所以，当印度主持人在结尾处引用莫迪扩张主义的中国这个说法时，马凯硕用一句非常直白的话做了回应。任何相信仁慈大国这种说法的人都是傻瓜。2000年来，所有大国都在恃强凌弱，这就是现实。而对付霸凌者的方法就是积蓄自己的力量，让自己变得强大。这段话既是给印度的忠告，也是对所有中小国家的启示。与其抱怨别人太强，不如问问自己为什么还不够强。与其纠结于历史恩怨，不如想想怎么把眼前的机遇转化为明天的实力。当然，以印度那种一贯的迷之自信和大国心态，马凯硕这番话能在多大程度上被听进去，恐怕要打个大大的问号。但无论如何，这场对话本身的价值是毋庸置疑的。它让我们看到了一个清醒、理性、有深度的亚洲声音，也让我们看到了某些媒体和所谓精英根深蒂固的偏见与双标。这两种视角的碰撞本身就是一堂生动的地缘政治课。说到这儿，我还想补充一点，这场对话之所以精彩，不仅仅是因为马凯硕说的在理，更因为他的对手那位印度主持人恰好是西方话语体系最忠实的代言人。他提出的每一个问题，从新疆到西藏，从民主到人权，从边境到贸易，都是西方媒体反复炒作的老套叙事。 他以为自己在主持一场正义的审判，结果却成了马凯硕解剖西方双标的最佳活教材。这种戏剧性的反差，让整场对话的张力拉满。马凯硕最厉害的地方在于，他从来不正面回答那些预设了陷阱的问题，而是重新定义问题的框架。当主持人问中国有没有民主，他谈的是亚洲和西方的不同历史路径；当主持人问新疆穆斯林怎么办，他反问穆斯林国家为什么不说话；当主持人问印度要不要对抗中国，他谈的是印度能不能利用中国。每一次他都在解构对方的问题本身，让对方意识到自己问错了问题。这种思维方式值得我们每个人学习。另外，马凯硕反复强调的不要感情用事，其实也是对所有发展中国家的一种提醒。在国际舞台上，情绪化往往意味着被动，意味着被人牵着鼻子走。真正高明的博弈者永远是冷静的、理性的、精于计算的。他们不会因为对方的一句话就勃然大怒，也不会因为一时的屈辱就做出冲动的决策。他们盯着的是10年后、20年后的棋盘，而不是眼前的一城一池。这种长线思维恰恰是很多国家最缺乏的，尤其是在社交媒体时代，舆论压力越来越大，政府往往被民意绑架，不得不做出一些短视的决策。但马凯硕提醒我们，真正的外交智慧是在喧嚣中保持清醒，在压力下坚持理性。好了，这期视频就到这里了。制作视频不易，如果您觉得做得不错，谢谢您动动手指订阅本频道。如果您有更多想法或者建议，也可以在评论区告诉我，都会认真阅读。下期见。